Hey guys, Dr. Mike Dusa, MTFU Longevity Over 50, www.mtfucoach.com. How are you? Depression and suicide. You see it a lot in the media these days. Looking back at my practice, my associate and I at one point some years ago, we did an analytic on our practice, all the thousands and thousands of patients we did see. And we had a lot of data stored in the computer, and we had software where we could figure out symptoms and different indices regarding patient presentations. And we found that almost 50% of patients who came in with back pain, neck pain, injury, whatever chiropractic problem they may have, along with that, almost 50% of patients also had a depressive component or a sadness component or a component that involved high anxiety. And that was very interesting. And difficult and dangerous only because a lot of times people lived with those problems, let's say depression, for such a long time that they lost their biofeedback. And biofeedback in this case basically means your understanding or ability to tell where you're at with yourself. You know what feels good, you know what feels bad. The sensitivity of your body is very acute and very well cultivated. Whereas if you have, let's say, depression for years, you may feel down for such a long time that you no longer realize that you're down. You just think being down is normal, and all of your actions and activities and things you do for yourself follow suit, and they're usually not good. And we saw that quite a bit. And ultimately, we couldn't really determine whether the pain from an injury caused depression or if the depression was already there and then they got injured, and being depressed had made the person have a more difficult time in rehabilitating themselves or following instructions or following through on treatment. So really, it was a real twisted and difficult situation in many cases. But that's just to give you a little example of how pervasive these mental disorders or human emotions are. And speaking of that, talking about, well, then you look at Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, two of the very famous people who took their own lives in the past week. You look at them ostensibly, and it looks like their lives are fantastic. They've got a lot of money. They're very, very accomplished, good-looking people. Anthony Bourdain, I never watched his show, but I guess he had some TV show where he would go all around the world and eat in different restaurants and check out food. I mean, that's almost kind of borders on a James Bond type of life. That's a very, very cool life. A lot of people would say, hey, I'd love to live like that guy. Has a ton of money, the whole thing. And Kate Spade owned a multi-billion-dollar company, handbags and women's accessories and whatnot. So a lot of success there too. But the outward appearance, the ostensible that you can see, has nothing to do with what's ruminating on the inside, as we know. How many people do you know that have a smile all the time, but they're kind of crying or dying on the inside? And then you look at as far as sadness and depression. Sadness is a normal emotion. It's triggered by an event. And remember, it's a human emotion. It's not necessarily an illness. Maybe you got a poor grade on a report card, or you got in a car accident, you wrecked your car, or your boyfriend or girlfriend left you, or some other happenstance occurred that made you sad for a while. Those are stressors or occurrences that causes a sadness. But once those stressors are corrected, you get a better grade, you get a new boyfriend, you get your car repaired. The sadness is likely to go away. So it's kind of transient, and it's a human emotion. Everybody has them. Whereas with depression, that's not an emotion. That's an illness. That's a sickness, and it's deeply seated. And one of the worst things that I've seen, and people mean well. You're in the trenches of depression, and people say things like snap out of it, or get over it, or just choose to be happy. Now, those people mean well, but in essence, those are pretty insulting statements because depression is far too nefarious of a foe, of an illness foe, for you to just say, hey, I'm going to snap out of this today. It's a chemical, in many cases, a chemical imbalance. In fact, there doesn't always have to be a reason. A lot of times you just find yourself, unlike sadness, where there's a stressor that causes a sadness, depression sometimes just comes on. And all of a sudden you find yourself depressed and sad, and things that at one time made you happy and you derive great joy from, and things that made you spring out of bed no longer do so. You no longer gain joy from the things you used to enjoy, and you generally feel sad about everything, and you just don't know why. And this can last for months. It could last for years, and in some cases, like a lot of my patients, looking back, many of them seemingly were suffering from depression in some cases for their entire adult lives. And a lot of them didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to face it. They found it insulting that that was a diagnosis, and they just didn't want to deal with it. But really, depression saps your energy, your motivation, and your ability to have joy. And generally, your thresholds are lower as far as things set you off quicker. You get angry quicker. You have more anxiety. You have difficulty getting over things. Everything is kind of slowed, and it takes a lot longer to bounce back from these things when you have the depression, because it's in there. It's part of your life for the in some cases, long term. Now, I'm going to just go over a list here. A list that we use to diagnose depression. And there are 9 factors here. Number 1, you need 5 of these to be diagnosed as having clinical depression. Number 1 is you must be depressed most of the time. As I mentioned earlier, number 2, you have a decrease or zero interest in things that previously interested you or gave you joy. You suffer, number 3, weight increases or decreases and appetite change. Number 4, you have a decrease or increase in sleep. I've had patients that slept 22 hours a day. I've seen people who wouldn't sleep for 5 days. And number 5, you feel restless and you feel slowed down. Number 6, you're tired and you have low energy most of the time. Number 7 is an esteem issue. You feel worthless and you just suffer increasing and high guilt. And a lot of times it's very ill-defined as far as what you feel guilt over. You just feel guilty. Number 8, your thinking, focus, and your concentration, as well as creativity, they all become problematic, or they're just not there. They're fragmented. And number 9, you have thoughts of suicide or dying. Now, there's 2 things. There's suicidal ideation, and there's suicidal intent. Ideation is when you just kind of entertain the notion, you think about it, you even talk about it to people, you might even write about it. These days you might put it on social media. I see people do that sometimes. They'll write something very cryptic, and everybody chimes in. Are you okay? And the person never says anything. You know what's that all about? But then there's suicidal intent. Where generally that's even more alarming, because generally with suicidal intent you intend to kill yourself, and you often do before anybody even knows it, and then they look back and maybe they see the signs afterward. But again, like I said, that's too late. Then there's excuse me, there's risk factors. In other words, situations you may have lived through, or factors that might be present that lend you to a higher potential to develop depression. Number 1 is if you suffer childhood trauma. Number 2, if you have the inability to cope with a devastating life event such as a death of a child or a spouse. Number 3, low self-esteem. Number 4, if you have a family history of mental illness, bipolar disorder, or any of the depressive disorders. Number 5, a drug history, drug abuse history. Number 6, if some people are ostracized for alternative lifestyles such as homosexuality, being a lesbian, LGBT, just not accepted into the fabric of society. Number 7, you may have a trouble adjusting to severe illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, and another one, chronic pain. Chronic pain, I just want to mention, true chronic pain, chronic meaning long-term. I've seen people suffer from true long-term chronic pain, which is so debilitating that the physical pain element doesn't become the worst thing. The worst thing is that the chronic pain literally changes your personality. And the problem is you become a different person, in effect, and the people who you were friends with, or family members, or co-workers, or spouse, or children, you're no longer the same person to them. So it fractures all of those relationships as well. So the tentacles from these problems are really diverse and widespread. Um, you may have number 8, trouble adjusting to a bodily change, such as having to adapt to a wheelchair, losing a limb, or even suffering paralysis. And finally, number 9, having a history of prior mental health issues involving eating disorders, anorexia or bulimia. And when I worked at the university years ago, I started a nutrition class. Look at these pop-ups again here. Zuckerberg strikes again. And I did nutrition inventories for hundreds of kids, freshman students, and particularly the females. They'd write out everything they ate for 7 days. And I looked at the females. It was often the females who were most deficient here. And you would see that they would maybe have a piece of pizza or a cup of soup, and then nothing for the rest of the day. And the next day they'd have a salad and maybe chew some gum at night. And this certainly wasn't because they weren't hungry, it's because there were issues involved. So we're looking at potential setup for depressive components there. And then finally, number 10, having a lack of support systems such as family and friends and people that you could lean upon. And then there's medications that can mitigate, such as beta blockers, corticosteroids, hormones, and statins. These can all lend themselves to depression. Things you can do. Well, there's a lot of things you can do. It's just a matter of the person implementing, because it's very, very hard to take action when you're held down by the bonds of depression. Number 1, you can connect with others. Number 2, add structure to your day. Again, when your life is obliterated by an event or just depression, and things you always love to do no longer entice you, it's hard to maintain that structure. And with no structure, you become listless and rudderless. And that lends to, it's a vicious cycle, lends to more depression and sadness. Number 4, physical activity, engaging in some gym work or sprints, or even just walking, doing anything. When I was disabled years ago, I was on crutches for 3.5 years. My father would just take me to the gym, and they had a couch in there at the time. This is well over 20 years ago. And I would just go down there. I couldn't do anything because I was on morphine also, so I truly couldn't do anything. You know how you say you could always do something? I couldn't do anything, but I'd go in there, I'd at least sit on the couch, and I'd be there at least. Then my father would pick me up a couple of hours later, and it was better than nothing. I was in a better atmosphere. You know, my surroundings more conducive to my potential, or at least one-time happiness. And if you like animals, get yourself a furry friend, because I know my dog always makes me feel happy no matter what kind of day I might have had. Whatever you do, do not self-medicate. Whatever you do, don't drink. Take illicit drugs or take overprescribed drugs, alcohol, and treat yourself well. Just eat well and try to sleep better. And it's not easy, but these are things you can be mindful of. And if you do them, they will help. Sometimes it's hard to pull a lever on these things. And if you have difficulty sleeping, like I do, I meditate and I read, and most of the time it works for me. And really, just minimalize or simplify your life. The more clutter you have, mental clutter and actual physical clutter, it's distracting, and it decreases your joy in life. I know it does for me. Again, those are just some things I just want to touch upon, because a lot of people suffer. A lot of people suffer in silence, and there's always a solution. Whatever your problem might be, I've always said your solution exists somewhere. You just have to want to find it. Maybe have one person that you can really count on. You're only as good as the people you're surrounded by. Don't expect to have a lot of them that really have interest in you and want to see you do well. Just try to find one. And if you can do these things, we can all hope for better mental health. That's it for today. Dr. Mike Dusa, MTFU Longevity Over 50, www.mtfucoach.com. And please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, MTFU Longevity Over 50. And for all new videos and health tips each and every day, I do thank you, Dr. Mike Dusa. I'll talk to you again.